Right, the last section, I don't have time to go through everything I'd like to go through, understandably, but the last section I'd like to deal with is medicine and doctors in the ancient world, because it's quite a fun thing to deal with. It comes a little surprise to learn that medicine in the ancient world was in a fairly dire state, at least compared with ourselves. As a result, many doctors were regarded with skepticism. There were doctors that were regarded more highly than others. Greek doctors were held in higher regard than Roman, and not surprising, the two most famous medical figures of the ancient world are both Greek, Galen and Hippocrates. Just to summarize, a 3rd century medical writer sums up attitudes toward doctors and medical practices in his lament that some doctors charge the most excessive prices for the most worthless medicines and drugs, and others in the craft attempt to deal with and treat diseases they obviously do not understand. Well, they had no idea at that stage that diseases were caused by microscopic living things called germs, and who knows what accompanied some of the practices. Now, that image there is an ancient portable medical bag, about 2,000 years ago. Those two doors at the bottom apparently open on hinges, and all sorts of things were found inside the medical bag, ointments, salves, scalpels. There are a set of ancient scalpels. I seem to think these come from Pompeii. I seem to think these were found in Pompeii. Actually not too different from our modern, in terms of design, from our modern instruments. Those are usually made of bronze or iron or a combination of the two. Regarding the state of medicine and attitudes toward doctors in the ancient world, some writers were wittier than others. There's a famous 1st century Roman satirist called Martial. He lived 1 or 2 generations after Jesus, and he had this to say about doctors. Oh, sorry. Yes, before I go on, that's very important. That's a close-up of a tooth of an ancient Egyptian. Now, the ancient Egyptians, believe it or not, had their dentists. They were called toothers. So you went to see a tooth if you had a toothache. And the interesting bit is that little section there on the right. That's a 5mm metal insertion, and it's evidence of very early dental surgery. Some toother had put that in the Egyptian's tooth for whatever reason, ward away the evil spirits or something, I don't know. But anyway, right, we'll go back to Martial. This is one of his quotes from his famous epigrams. Until recently, Dialis was a doctor. He is now an undertaker. He is still doing as an undertaker what he used to do as a doctor. Another one of Martial's epigrams. You are now a gladiator, although until recently you were an ophthalmologist. You did the same thing as a doctor that you now do as a gladiator. A Greek wit had similar sentiments. Sophocles, promising to set Diodorus' crooked back straight, piled 3 solid stones on the hunchback's spine. He was crushed and died, but his spine became straighter than a ruler. And finally, Phidon did not purge me with a cluster or even feel me, but feeling feverish, I remembered his name and died. So Romans seem to have been fairly skeptical toward their doctors. Of course, the question is raised, what about Israel? How did Israelites feel toward their doctors? There's a famous quote from a Jewish sage of the 2nd century BC called Ben Sirach. He says, "Give doctors the honor they deserve, for the Lord gave them their work to do. Their skill came from the Most High, and kings reward them for it. Their knowledge gives them a position of importance, and powerful people hold them in high regard." Now, this is quite a pivotal reference. This book is quite important from a medical history point of view, because up until then, doctors were regarded very skeptically in ancient Israel, and Ben Sirach starts to change things. We see from this time they start to become regarded more positively. In fact, it was laid down by the rabbis that doctors had to be present in the temple to look after the priests and to sort out their ailments. Still others, however, were skeptical. In the opinion of one rabbi recorded in the Talmud, the best of doctors is destined for Gehenna, which is the Jewish word for hell. So it seems that, again, there was the somewhat ambivalent attitude that the Israelites had toward doctors. As far as Nazareth was concerned, very small place. Was there a doctor? I'm inclined to think not. If something went wrong, if somebody fell ill, one would think one could go up the hill to Sepphoris. Sepphoris will almost certainly have doctors, certainly a royal doctor to look after Herod Antipas. Of course, reading it in the light of the Gospels, we're in a position now to understand the plight of the poor, the famous issue of the woman with the flow of blood, recorded in Mark 5, where it said she suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had, no doubt much of it on worthless medicine that the doctors didn't fully understand, according to that earlier quote. So we're now in a better position to see and understand the sort of medical care or not that the ancients received. And finally, is there life after Nazareth? Unfortunately, the story of Jesus growing up in Nazareth has a sad ending. In Luke chapter 4, we read the account of Jesus having been baptized by John in the Jordan, having been anointed by the Holy Spirit. He launches out into his mission in life, into his ministry, and shortly after that, he returns to his hometown of Nazareth and stands and speaks in the synagogue. When he stands to speak, he sees across from them faces he has known from childhood. He knows them very well and they know him. No secrets. Then he does something remarkable. Luke chapter 4. He proclaims himself to be the Messiah. Now, you could have heard a pin drop, no doubt. He's speaking to people who have known him all their lives. They watched him grow up from his earliest days. We note their reaction. We read that immediately all the people in the synagogue were furious when they heard this. They got up, drove him out of the town, and took him to the brow of the hill on which the town was built in order to throw him off the cliff. Now, just a bit of trivia about this. It wasn't actually a lynching in the sense of throwing him off the highest place they could find. Scholars indicate that that's probably the first step in the process of stoning, as it would have taken in the first century. We often think of stoning as just standing around throwing stones on somebody with no real process or order behind it. But in actual fact, in the first century, stoning took a particular procedure. The first part of the procedure was to find an area, I think it was twice the height of a man or 3 times the height of a man, and the victim would be thrown down and stunned, almost as a mercy, and then the individual would be stoned. And the point of the stoning, incidentally, was that you weren't allowed to touch the person because you'd become impure, so the stoning would ensure that you stayed a distance away. So they took him to the brow of the hill on which Nazareth was built to throw him off the cliff as the first process of that, as the first step in that stoning process. Tragically, all at once, it means that Jesus is rejected by many of those closest to him. He's not the only one in the Gospels who would face rejection. In John chapter 9, we read that the blind man is cured by Jesus, healed by Jesus. He gets expelled from the synagogue by the Pharisees. Jesus warns his disciples that they must expect a life of hardship and rejection. He says, you'll be whipped in the synagogues, you'll be chased from town to town. Indeed, the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. Such was his life, and such was the life that his disciples could expect. A few verses down, in verse 31 of Luke 4, we read that, then he came to Capernaum, a town in Galilee, and on the Sabbath he taught the people. So Jesus treks northeast 32 kilometers up to Capernaum on the Sea of Galilee. There he will settle down for his 3-year ministry. He will base his 3-year ministry. He will find new friends, a new life, and a new spiritual family. But that, as they say, and as I conclude in the end of my book, is another story. Thank you very much indeed. I hope you've been blessed by that. I'm going to open up to if anybody has any questions. First of all, I'd just like to say one or two things, go back to my book, say 1 or 2 things about my books. Today's talk covered just 1 or 2 chapters of the book. The book itself is 200 pages long. I'm looking to retail it at about 99 Rand or so. It's extremely reasonable. And naturally, there's a lot more data in the book itself. Just a bit about myself. A few years ago, I set up a modest publishing company called Erasmus House Publishing. And as I said, I've written 3 books. There are samples of them here. They're not for sale. These are my own copies.